Karen calls 911 when black man changes his own WiFi password. She had no idea what he found out. Derek had just moved into his new apartment, excited about starting fresh in a new neighborhood. It had been a long time since he'd felt the weight of a new beginning, and he was ready to settle into his life. He wasn't expecting any drama. He just wanted to enjoy the peace and quiet that came with the idea of living somewhere new. As he unloaded boxes from his car and set them in the living room, he could hear the faint sounds of his neighbors going about their business. It was a relatively quiet building, which he appreciated. The last thing he wanted was to be surrounded by chaos. But his peace would soon be interrupted. Karen, his new neighbor from across the hall, was an older woman who had been living in the building for years. From the moment Derek had stepped into the building, she had been overly friendly, almost too friendly. She'd greeted him at the door when he first arrived, giving him a quick rundown of the building's rules. At first, it seemed harmless, just a neighbor being nice. But as the days went by, Derek started noticing how often she would check in on him, asking questions that felt just a little too personal. He would be walking to his car and she'd be there, asking if he needed anything. She'd comment on the weather, then segue into a question about his job or where he came from. At first, he thought maybe she was just being friendly, trying to make sure he felt welcome. But soon, it became clear that Karen was a little too eager to know everything about him. It was as if she couldn't help herself, like she was drawn to him in a way that made Derek uncomfortable. He decided to ignore it. After all, he didn't want to make things awkward with his neighbors, and she did seem harmless enough. But then one evening, as he was trying to connect to the building's Wi-Fi, something strange happened. The Wi-Fi password that had been given to him by the landlord wasn't working. Derek tried again, making sure he entered the password correctly, but it didn't work. Frustrated, he called the landlord to ask for help, but he didn't get a response. It was the third time in the past week that the landlord hadn't answered his calls, and Derek was starting to grow irritated. He needed to get his work done, and being without the internet wasn't helping. So, without much thought, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He had a few minutes to spare, so he grabbed his laptop and logged into the router's settings. Derek was no tech expert, but he knew enough to get by. He typed in the default username and password, accessed the router's settings, and changed the password to something he could easily remember. It was a simple fix, and once he was connected, Derek felt a small sense of satisfaction. He could now get on with his evening without having to worry about Wi-Fi issues. Little did he know, this small decision would lead to a series of events that would change everything. What Derek hadn't realized was that Karen, who had been watching from her window, had seen him fiddling with the router. She was always watching, always curious. It wasn't long before Derek realized she had been paying attention to everything he did. He was unaware of how much she had noticed, but Karen couldn't help but think there was something suspicious about what she had seen. She had watched him approach the router, take it into his hands, and start typing. She didn't know what he was doing, but she knew it wasn't normal. After all, people don't just change their Wi-Fi passwords without asking anyone, right? It seemed odd to her, and in her mind, odd behavior was something to be concerned about. Karen began to feel a sense of unease. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but her gut told her that something wasn't right. There had been stories in the news about people getting into other people's Wi-Fi networks, stealing personal information, and using it for illegal purposes. She had no idea if that's what Derek was doing, but the thought crossed her mind. Karen's suspicions grew as she thought about Derek more and more. She had noticed the way he didn't seem to fit in with the other residents of the building. He was younger, different from the people who usually lived here. She didn't know where he was from, but he wasn't like the others, and for some reason, that made her uneasy. As the hours passed, her mind kept racing with thoughts of what he might be doing. Maybe he was hacking into the system. Maybe he was using the Wi-Fi for something illegal. The more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself that there was something shady going on. She couldn't be sure, but she had to do something about it. In the end, Karen decided to call 911. She didn't know what else to do. She was scared and worried, and it felt like the right thing to do. She dialed the emergency number, trying to sound calm as she explained that there was a strange man in the building who had changed the Wi-Fi password. The dispatcher on the other end was confused at first, asking for more details. But Karen couldn't explain exactly what was wrong. She just had this feeling that something was off, and she didn't want to take any chances. So she told the dispatcher that Derek might be doing something illegal. The dispatcher, still uncertain, decided to send a patrol car to check on the situation. Derek had no idea any of this was happening. He was in his apartment, relaxing after a long day and trying to catch up on some work. He didn't think anything of it when he heard a knock on his door. He figured it was just another neighbor asking about the Wi-Fi or offering help with something else. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to see two uniformed police officers standing in the hallway looking at him. The officers greeted him politely but asked if everything was okay. Derek, still confused, tried to figure out what was going on. The officers explained that they had been called because someone reported a suspicious person in the building, and they needed to check things out. Derek tried to hold back his laughter. Suspicious person? He hadn't done anything wrong, just changed his Wi-Fi password. He explained to the officers that it was his right to do so, and there was no cause for concern. But the officers seemed hesitant, unsure of whether to leave or press further. They apologized for the misunderstanding and assured Derek that it wasn't a big deal. After a few awkward moments, they left, telling him to stay alert and aware of any potential issues in the building. As Derek closed the door behind him, he couldn't help but shake his head. What had just happened? He had changed his Wi-Fi password, and suddenly he was being treated like a criminal. It was an odd and unsettling experience, and Derek couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the whole situation. Meanwhile, Karen was back in her apartment, sitting by the window, waiting for the officers to leave. She watched as they walked away, still unsure if she had done the right thing. But in her mind, she had done what she thought was best. She wasn't sure what she had seen, but she felt better knowing that someone had checked on Derek. At least, that's what she told herself. The next day, Derek tried to go about his business as usual. He had spent a long evening catching up on work after the police visit, but the whole situation left a bad taste in his mouth. He had done nothing wrong, yet he had been treated like someone who might be a criminal. The incident had left him confused and a little uncomfortable in his new home. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been unfairly singled out, but he decided not to dwell on it too much. He was determined not to let it ruin his day or his time in the new apartment. As he walked down the hallway toward the elevator, Derek spotted Karen in the corridor. She was standing near her door, fiddling with her keys, looking like she had just returned from somewhere. She spotted him at the same time, and before he could even think about avoiding her, Karen called out to him with a smile. "Good morning, Derek. How's the Wi-Fi working for you today?" she asked, her tone a little too cheerful, almost forced. Derek paused for a moment. He hadn't expected to see her so soon, and the awkwardness of their previous interaction made him hesitate. He decided to answer politely, though. There was no reason to be rude, and he didn't want to escalate things. "It's fine, thanks," he said, trying to keep the conversation short. "I got it sorted out." Karen nodded, though there was a slight hesitation in her eyes. Derek could see that she wasn't entirely comfortable either, but she pushed on, determined to make small talk. "That's good to hear. You know, I was thinking about what happened yesterday. I hope you didn't feel like we were overreacting. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay," she said, her voice faltering just a little bit. Derek frowned. He wasn't sure if she was genuinely apologizing or if she was just trying to cover up what had happened. He wasn't angry, but the whole thing had caught him off guard, and now it seemed like she was trying to brush it off like it wasn't a big deal. "I mean, it's all right," Derek replied, trying to remain calm. "But I was a little confused by it. I didn't think changing a Wi-Fi password would lead to a visit from the cops." Karen looked down at her feet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. She took a deep breath and seemed to gather her thoughts before speaking again. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I saw you messing with the router and I didn't know what to think. It seemed a bit strange, and you've got to understand, I've been living here for so long and I've seen a lot of people come and go. I just wanted to make sure nothing was wrong, that's all." Derek blinked, processing her words. He had heard her out, but now he was starting to feel a little more uncomfortable than before. She was talking in circles, trying to justify her actions, but it didn't really make sense. It was clear that Karen had been watching him more closely than he had realized. "Look, I get it," Derek said slowly, trying to keep his tone even. "I understand wanting to make sure everything is okay around here, but it felt a little Off, like I was being watched. Corinne's face turned slightly red. She wasn't used to being confronted like this, and it showed. She quickly glanced away as if trying to collect her thoughts. I didn't mean to make you feel that way, she said, her voice softer now. Honestly, I just get worried sometimes. I see new people, and I don't always know who they are or where they're from. I guess I let my worries get the best of me. Derek nodded, not sure how to respond. He could tell Corinne was trying to make excuses, but at the same time he could sense a hint of sincerity in her words. He wasn't angry anymore, just disappointed by how things had turned out. He didn't want to hold on to this frustration, especially not with someone he had to live next to. It's okay, Derek said, offering a small smile. I just hope we can keep things cool, Corinne smiled back, though it looked a little forced. Of course. I really didn't mean any harm, I'm just a bit of a busybody sometimes. Derek laughed a little at that. I think I've noticed. They shared a brief, awkward chuckle, but the moment quickly passed. Derek excused himself and stepped into the elevator, eager to get to work. As the doors closed, he glanced back at Corinne. She was still standing there watching him, but this time her expression had softened a little. Maybe she wasn't as bad as he'd first thought, but it was clear she still had a lot to learn about boundaries and personal space. Later that afternoon, Corinne sat in her apartment, staring out the window, her mind racing. She hadn't expected Derek to call her out like that. She had been so sure of her actions, convinced that she was doing the right thing by calling 911. But now, after speaking with him, she wasn't so sure anymore. Derek had been calm and understanding, not confrontational or defensive, but the encounter had made her realize something. She had been too quick to judge him. She had seen him change the Wi-Fi password, and instead of asking him about it, she had made assumptions. She didn't know him, and yet she had let her doubts and suspicions guide her actions. What if Derek was right? What if he was just a guy trying to fix his internet, and she had blown it out of proportion? Corinne's thoughts turned inward as she reflected on her behavior. She had grown comfortable in her little bubble, knowing everyone around her and making sure things were in order. But maybe she hadn't been as welcoming as she thought. Maybe she had been too quick to label someone she didn't know, based on nothing more than a simple action. She had to admit to herself that she was a little scared of change, of people who didn't fit the mold she had created in her head. Corinne took a deep breath, resolving to do better. She needed to get to know Derek, not just assume things about him based on her own insecurities. But it wouldn't be easy. Breaking old habits was tough, especially when she had lived in the same place for so long and never had to confront her own biases. But she was willing to try. Later that evening, Derek saw Corinne again in the hallway. This time, she didn't avoid eye contact. She smiled at him and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Derek nodded back, though he wasn't sure if the awkwardness between them had completely disappeared. It was going to take time to rebuild any sense of trust, but at least they were both making an effort. For now, that would have to be enough. The next few days felt strangely quiet for Derek. He had been hoping for a smooth transition into his new place, but the awkward encounter with Corinne still lingered in the back of his mind. While he was determined not to let it bother him, the tension in the air was hard to ignore. It wasn't that he was angry anymore, but the situation had left him feeling uneasy. Derek tried to focus on his work, keeping his head down and moving forward with his day-to-day routine. But as he settled into his apartment and unpacked the last of his boxes, he couldn't shake the thought of what had happened. It wasn't just about the Wi-Fi password. It was about the feeling of being watched and judged by someone who didn't even know him. It was unsettling, to say the least. Meanwhile, Corinne was dealing with her own set of emotions. After their brief conversation in the hallway, she had felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. She knew she had overstepped her boundaries, but Derek's calm and understanding demeanor had made her rethink her actions. For the first time in a long while, she began to question her own judgments. Why had she assumed the worst about Derek simply because he was new? Corinne had always prided herself on being friendly and approachable, but she realized she hadn't always been as open-minded as she thought. Her fears and anxieties had taken control, and she had acted on them without stopping to consider the impact on others. She spent the next few days reflecting on her behavior. She tried to push away the nagging feeling that she had made a mistake, but it wasn't easy. Corinne had always been a bit of a busybody, always wanting to know what was going on in her building and in the lives of those around her. But now, She was beginning to see that her curiosity could sometimes cross the line into intrusion. She thought about Derek, about how calm and collected he had been during their conversation. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gotten defensive. He had simply shared his perspective, and Karen had realized just how much she had misjudged the situation. Derek had every right to change his Wi-Fi password, and Karen had no right to call the police over something so trivial. Karen knew she needed to do something to make things right. She couldn't just leave things as they were, with the awkwardness hanging between them. She had to apologize properly. But how? She sat in her apartment for hours, scribbling down thoughts on a piece of paper, trying to figure out the best way to express her feelings. She wasn't good at confrontation, and the last thing she wanted was to make things worse. But she knew that if she didn't try, the tension between them would continue to grow. She couldn't let this fester. Finally, she decided to write Derek a letter. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like the right way to approach things. In the letter, she apologized for calling the police and explained that she had acted out of fear and ignorance. She admitted that she hadn't considered how her actions might affect him and that she had been wrong to assume the worst. She assured him that she had learned from the experience and that she hoped they could move forward with mutual respect. Once the letter was written, Karen felt a sense of relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that was all she could do. She slipped the letter under Derek's door that evening, hoping he would read it and understand where she was coming from. She wasn't sure how he would respond, but at least she had made the effort. The next morning, Derek found the letter lying on his doorstep. It was folded neatly, with his name written on the outside in Karen's careful handwriting. He picked it up and read through it quietly, his heart sinking a little as he read the words. He hadn't expected an apology from her, but there it was. The letter was simple but heartfelt, and it made him pause. Derek wasn't one to hold grudges. He understood that people made mistakes, and he didn't want to keep the tension going. But at the same time, it hurt to know that someone had jumped to conclusions about him without even trying to get to know him. Still, he appreciated the fact that Karen had taken the time to write the letter. It was a step in the right direction. After reading it, he decided to respond, but he wanted to do it in person. He didn't want to leave things hanging, not after everything that had happened. So later that day, he knocked on Karen's door. When Karen opened the door, she looked surprised to see him standing there, holding the letter she had written in his hand. "Hey, Karen," Derek said with a small smile. "I got your letter." Karen's face flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, you read it. I hope you didn't think it was too much." Derek shook his head. "No, it wasn't too much. Actually, I really appreciated it." Karen looked relieved. "I'm glad. I wanted to make sure you knew I was sorry. I shouldn't have done what I did. I let my own fears get the best of me, and I didn't take the time to think things through." Derek nodded. "I get it. I was caught off guard, but I know it wasn't meant to be malicious. I'm glad we could talk about it." There was a pause, and for a moment, neither of them knew quite what to say. But then Karen spoke up again, this time with a sincerity that Derek couldn't ignore. "I just wanted to say, I'm going to try to be better about this, about not jumping to conclusions. I guess I've always been a bit too quick to judge, but I see now that I have to let people be who they are without assuming anything." Derek smiled, feeling a sense of relief. "I think that's all anyone can do, just try to be better." The two of them stood there for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. They hadn't solved everything, but the tension had been broken. Derek could see that Karen genuinely wanted to make amends, and that meant a lot. They both had room to grow, and this was just the beginning of a new understanding between them. Before Derek left, he said one last thing. "I think we're good now. Let's just keep things cool, okay?" Karen nodded, smiling a little. "Definitely, and thank you, Derek, for being so understanding." As Derek walked back to his apartment, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The awkwardness had been cleared up, and for the first time in a while, he felt like he could relax. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And that was enough. The next few weeks seemed to pass more smoothly for both Derek and Karen. They had worked through the awkwardness between them, and while they weren't exactly close friends, there was an understanding between them now. The building, which once felt like a strange, impersonal place, was starting to feel a little more like home to Derek. He could go about his days without feeling as if his every move was being watched. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to have a newfound sense of awareness. She was still the same friendly woman who often greeted her neighbors in the hallway, but there was a subtle change in her behavior. She no longer pried into people's lives as much, and Derek noticed that she had become quieter, more respectful of people's boundaries. It was clear that she was trying to be more mindful of how she interacted with others, and for that he respected her. One afternoon, Derek was sitting at his desk working on a project when he heard a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he hesitated before getting up to answer it. When he opened the door, he found Karen standing there, holding a small potted plant in her hands. "Hi, Derek," Karen said, her voice a little hesitant. "I thought I'd stop by and bring you this. It's just a little something to say thanks for being understanding." Derek looked at the plant in surprise. It was a small, vibrant succulent, the kind that didn't need much attention, just a little sunlight and occasional watering. He smiled, surprised by the gesture. "That's really kind of you, Karen," Derek said, taking the plant from her. "But you really didn't have to." Karen shrugged, looking down at the plant in her hands. "I know, but I felt like I should do something. You're a good neighbor, and I know I made things uncomfortable for you at first." Derek glanced at the plant, touched by the thoughtfulness. He had never expected Karen to go out of her way like this, but it was clear that she was trying to make amends in her own way. "It's really thoughtful, thank you," he said, smiling. "I'll take good care of it." Karen smiled back, her expression softening. "I'm glad. I just wanted to show you that I appreciate you being so understanding, and well, I'm learning to be more mindful too. I've realized that I don't always need to get involved in other people's business." Derek chuckled softly. "Yeah, I think we could all benefit from a little more space sometimes." Karen laughed along with him. "I guess that's true. Anyway, I won't take up too much of your time. I just wanted to give you the plant, and, well, I hope we can move forward without any more misunderstandings." Derek nodded, feeling relieved. The tension that had once been there seemed to have melted away, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. "I think we're good." "Thanks again for the plant, Karen." With a small smile, Karen turned to leave. "You're welcome, Derek. Take care." As she walked down the hallway, Derek stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. He didn't know what the future would hold with her as a neighbor, but he felt a little more hopeful now. It was clear that both of them had learned something from the experience, and while things might never be perfect, they were at least making an effort. Over the next few days, Derek took extra care of the plant, placing it on his windowsill where it could get plenty of sunlight. It became a small but comforting reminder of how far he and Karen had come in such a short time. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of the apology and the conversation they'd had, the way Karen had tried to make things right. One evening, as Derek was returning home after a long day of work, he saw Karen again in the hallway. This time, there was no awkwardness, no tension. They exchanged casual greetings, and Derek could tell that Karen was genuinely making an effort to be more thoughtful in her interactions. "I'm glad to see you're doing well," Derek said with a smile as he walked past her. Karen returned the smile. "Thanks, Derek. Same to you." As the days went by, the two of them continued to share small conversations in the hallway. Derek never felt like he had to guard his words or second-guess her motives. Karen had proven that she was willing to grow, and that made all the difference. It wasn't long before Derek started noticing a few other subtle changes in the building. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves were beginning to engage more with each other. The usual cliques and gossip that had dominated the building's atmosphere started to fade, replaced by a more open and friendly environment. Derek wasn't sure if Karen's shift in behavior had something to do with it, but he couldn't help but think that her small act of kindness had started a ripple effect. One day, Derek found himself in the lobby, chatting with another neighbor, a young woman named Claire, whom he hadn't spoken to much before. They talked about work, the weather, and how things were going in the building. For once, Derek felt like he was part of the community, not just an outsider looking in. It was a welcome feeling, especially after the awkward start to his time here. It was clear that things were changing for the better. Derek had always believed that people could change, and now he was seeing it firsthand. Karen, who had once been overly judgmental and quick to call for help, was learning to be more compassionate, to look beyond the surface, and to give people the benefit of the doubt. Derek, in turn, was learning to let go of past grievances and to approach each situation with a little more patience. One evening, as Derek sat on his balcony, enjoying the quiet after another busy day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The plant that Karen had given him sat on the table beside him, thriving in the sunlight. It was a small thing, but it felt like a symbol of how far they had come. Derek knew that life in the building wouldn't always be smooth sailing. There would be disagreements, misunderstandings, and challenges ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. He had neighbors who cared, and he had learned that sometimes it just takes a small gesture to change everything. As the sun set behind him, casting a warm glow across the city, Derek allowed himself a deep breath. Things were getting better, and that was enough for now. The days that followed seemed to unfold with a quiet sense of normalcy. Derek had settled into his new life in the building, and despite the awkwardness of the past, he was starting to feel more at ease. His interactions with Karen had become more casual and respectful, and although they weren't close friends, there was a mutual understanding between them. It was enough to make the atmosphere feel more welcoming and less tense. One morning, as Derek was leaving for work, he ran into Karen in the lobby. This time, their exchange felt completely natural. Karen was sitting on a bench near the elevator, sipping a coffee and reading a book. As Derek passed by, she looked up and waved. "Morning, Derek." "How's it going?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "Good, good, just another busy day ahead," Derek replied, smiling back. "How about you?" "I'm doing well," Karen said with a grin. "Just taking it easy this morning, thought I'd get a head start on the day." It was a simple, friendly conversation, nothing extraordinary, but for Derek, it felt like a sign that things were really improving. He wasn't used to having pleasant exchanges with neighbors, especially after such an awkward start. It felt good to know that he could have a conversation with Karen without it being strained or uncomfortable. As the weeks passed, Derek found himself becoming more involved with the people around him. His interactions with the other tenants in the building had started to shift. They were no longer the cold, distant exchanges he had once experienced. Instead, there was a growing sense of camaraderie. People were talking more, greeting each other in passing, and even sharing small moments of connection. Derek had no illusions. This wasn't the perfect community, but it was a start, and it made living there a lot easier. One afternoon, as Derek was on his way to the grocery store, he bumped into Claire, the neighbor he had chatted with once before. She was carrying a bag of vegetables, heading back to her apartment after a shopping trip of her own. "Hey, Derek," Claire called out with a friendly wave. "You want a hand with that? Looks like you've got a bit of a load there." Derek smiled, grateful for the offer. "Thanks, Claire, that would be great." As they walked together to their apartments, they talked about their days. It wasn't deep conversation, but it was the kind of small talk that made the building feel less like a collection of strangers and more like a community. Claire shared a few funny stories about her job, and Derek talked about the work he'd been doing at home. "Seems like we're all just trying to make it through the day," Claire said with a laugh as they reached her door. "But at least we've got good neighbors, right?" Derek nodded. "Yeah, it's nice to have a few good people around. It makes things easier." After parting ways, Derek found himself thinking about what Claire had said. He realized that he was starting to feel like a part of the building, rather than an outsider. The interactions with Karen, Claire, and others were small, but they were meaningful. They had built a foundation of respect and understanding that had slowly turned the place from just a building into a home. Karen had noticed the change, too. She had started to see the building in a different light. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to the usual routine, talking to the same people, seeing the same faces every day. But now, with Derek and the others slowly opening up, she was beginning to see a shift. It wasn't just her anymore. Other people were reaching out, starting conversations and forming connections. One evening, Karen decided to host a small gathering in the building's common room. She wanted to bring people together to celebrate the sense of community they had slowly been building. It wasn't a big party, just a few neighbors who had shown interest in getting to know each other better. Derek was invited, of course, and though he wasn't sure what to expect, he agreed to come. When he arrived, he was pleasantly surprised. The room was cozy, with lights strung up around the edges and soft music playing in the background. There were a few snacks on the table, and people were chatting casually, laughing and enjoying each other's company. Karen greeted him with a warm smile, offering him a drink as he entered. "I'm so glad you could make it, Derek," Karen said, genuinely pleased. "It's good to have everyone in one place." Derek looked around the room, seeing familiar faces, Claire, a few other neighbors, and even some people he hadn't met before. It was nice to see everyone gathered, not just as tenants of the building, but as people connecting with each other. Derek grabbed a drink and mingled, talking to Claire about a recent movie he had watched and discussing a few neighborhood updates with another neighbor, a middle-aged man named Jack. As the evening wore on, Derek found himself in a corner with Karen. She was talking to a couple of people about a recent gardening project she had started, and Derek joined in the conversation. He was amazed at how natural it all felt. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just people enjoying each other's company. "I'm glad we did this," Karen said, turning to Derek with a smile. "It's been a while since we've had a chance to really talk to each other like this." Derek nodded. "Yeah, it's been great. I think we could all use more moments like this." As the night came to a close, people began to say their goodbyes. Derek felt a sense of contentment wash over him. The evening had been relaxed, enjoyable, and most importantly, genuine. He had met new people, laughed with his neighbors, and felt a sense of belonging that he hadn't experienced in a long time. On his way out, Karen stopped him at the door. "I'm really glad you came tonight, Derek. I know it's not always easy to open up, but it's nice to see everyone starting to connect. I hope we can keep this up." Derek smiled, feeling a genuine warmth toward Karen. "I think we will. It's been good to be a part of something like this." With that, he walked out into the night, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt before. He had found his place in the building, and though it hadn't been easy, he was grateful for the journey. It wasn't just about living in the same place. It was about creating something real, something that made everyone feel like they belonged. As he headed to his apartment, Derek glanced at the plant on his windowsill, the one Karen had given him. It was thriving, a symbol of growth and new beginnings. He had come a long way since that first awkward interaction with Karen, and he knew that, in time, this place would feel like home, not just because of the walls around him, but because of the people who filled it. By the time the weeks had passed since Karen's small gathering, Derek had found a new rhythm to his life in the building. It no longer felt like just a place to live. It had transformed into a community. Something small but meaningful had started to grow. At first, he had been an outsider, unfamiliar with his neighbors and unsure of what to expect. But now he felt like he was part of something larger than just the building's walls. He had made friends, shared moments of laughter, and experienced a sense of belonging that he hadn't had in a long time. One evening, as he came home from work, he found himself walking through the lobby at a different pace. The usual rush to his apartment had slowed. He now paused to exchange casual greetings with neighbors in the hallway. Claire was often in the lobby, coming and going, and they shared quick chats about everything from local news to their favorite books. Jack, the middle-aged man from the gathering, would wave as he left for his evening walks. Even Karen had become more of a familiar face in the building, someone he could wave to with a friendly nod or stop to chat for a few minutes. Derek had found himself learning something valuable through his interactions with the other tenants, something that had always been easy to forget when life got too busy. He learned that simple connections mattered. In a world where people were often too busy or too preoccupied to notice each other, these small moments of shared humanity meant more than he had expected. One evening, Derek was sitting on his balcony, sipping a cup of tea, when he heard someone approach from behind. He turned to find Karen, who was coming home from a walk around the neighborhood. She was smiling, looking relaxed, and as always, she had that warm, welcoming energy about her. "Hey, Derek, mind if I join you for a bit?" she asked, gesturing to the chair beside him. Derek smiled and moved his cup to the side. "Of course, Karen, it's nice to see you. How's your evening going?" Karen settled into the chair with a sigh of relief. "Oh, it's been good, just getting some fresh air. You know, with everything going on in the building, it feels good to get out and clear my head." Derek nodded. "I get that. It's been nice around here lately. Everyone's been talking to each other more." "That's true," Karen said, glancing out at the view from the balcony. "I'm glad we've started making more of an effort to connect. It's easy to forget that we're all living in the same place. Sometimes I think I took it for granted." "Same here," Derek said. "At first, I didn't know how things were going to go. I was just trying to keep to myself, but I'm glad I got to know everyone. It makes living here a lot more enjoyable." Karen smiled, looking over at him. "You know, I never expected things to change so much. I think a lot of it had to do with you, actually. I realized that my own way of thinking, my quick judgments, wasn't helping anyone. I needed to slow down and listen more." Derek was surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I think we all have our moments of growth," he said, taking another sip of tea. I've learned that too. I wasn't expecting things to turn out like this when I moved in, but now it feels like we've built something here. There was a brief silence as both of them looked out at the city skyline. The sun had just set, casting a warm, golden light over everything. Derek couldn't help but think how different everything felt now. The building, which had once seemed like just a place to stay, now felt like home. After a few moments, Karen spoke again, her voice thoughtful. It's funny, isn't it? How things can change just by being a little kinder, by being more open with each other. Derek smiled. Yeah, it doesn't take much, just being willing to talk, to connect. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the peacefulness of the evening. Derek felt content, knowing that this newfound sense of community wasn't something that could easily be taken away. It had been built on mutual understanding, small gestures, and a willingness to grow. They had all played a part in making the building feel more like a home, and for that, Derek was grateful. As the night wore on, Karen stood up, stretching her arms. I think I'm going to head inside soon. It's been nice chatting with you, Derek. He stood as well, nodding. Yeah, it's been good. Let's do this again sometime. Karen smiled and nodded before turning to walk toward her apartment. Definitely. Derek watched her go, a sense of peace settling over him. It was amazing how much had changed since the early days of awkwardness and tension. He had once wondered if he would ever feel truly comfortable in this building, but now it felt like home in a way he hadn't expected. The next few days passed quietly. Derek continued to settle into his routine, but there was a noticeable shift in the building's atmosphere. People were talking more, interacting more. The little moments of connection added up, creating a stronger bond between the tenants. Karen's efforts had sparked something in the community, and others had followed her lead. It was clear that the sense of togetherness wasn't a one-time thing. It was something that was becoming a part of their everyday lives. One afternoon, as Derek was returning home from work, he noticed a small crowd gathered outside the building. A few of his neighbors were chatting excitedly, looking up at something. Curiosity piqued, he approached the group. What's going on? Derek asked, looking around. Oh, hey, Derek, Claire said with a grin. We're just watching the sunset. It's been so beautiful lately, we thought we'd all gather out here and enjoy it together. Derek looked up at the sky, which was painted with hues of orange, pink, and purple. The view from the building had always been good, but tonight it was something special. That sounds nice, Derek said, joining the group. I'm in. As they all stood there watching the sunset together, Derek realized how far they had come. The building wasn't just a place to live, it was a community, and it had become something he could truly call home. As the last of the daylight faded, Derek felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people around him. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in a world that often felt divided, it was nice to know that small acts of kindness could bring people together. Derek knew that this was just the beginning. The community they had started to build would continue to grow, and he was excited to be a part of it.